This happened in Yerushalayim and Harnof, and I spoke about this tragedy and how we should relate to it many times in the past week, and we will once again at the second part of today's Shir. But let's start with Divrei Torah. There's a story told in Sanhedrin Daf Samaches. Kishacholo Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos was the Gadol Hador in his day and age. And when he fell ill, Nechnasu Chachmei Yisrael Livakro. The great sages of Israel came to visit. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos was a kapdan, as we see from many sugis and shas. And when they walk into his room, he asks, Ad ato lama lo bosa. I haven't seen you for a while. Rabbi Eliezer Shemuti, and most of the Gedolim did not be Mekabel Torah Mepiv. So one of them answered, obviously a not very convincing response. He said, Lo hoyo lanu pnai. We didn't have time. And he says, is that so? I wonder whether any of you will die a natural death. That's what Rabbi Eliezer says. Obviously, they are shocked and dismayed. Rabbi Kiva was the brightest of them, and he had more of a kesher with Rabbi Eliezer than the others. So Rabbi Kiva asks, Shali Mahu. What will be the end of my days? And Rabbi Eliezer says, Shalchot kosher meshalahem. Your demise will be more terrible than all the others. Rashi writes, Sheyesh lecho leiv pasuach ku'ulam ve'ilo shamashtani hayita lomed Torah harbe. Because you're so bright, and because HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestowed you with such an amazing mind, if you would be mishamish me and learn my Torah, you would go a long way. So therefore, your death will be more tragic than all the others. And that's the end of the story in Babli, in Sanhedrin of Samaches. And we wonder what transpired then. Was that the end? So what did they do? Did they just say goodbye and walk out? What happened next? And the Gemara doesn't tell us, but the Zohar does. In Re'eh Mehemna. So the Zohar says, Rabbi Kiva responds and says, Rabbi, oileflon oiraiso. Rabbi, teach us Torah. Lomelana. Let's learn. And then Rabbi Eliezer starts elaborating on Shira Shirim. Samchuni ba'ashishus, Rabduni b'tapuchim ki choilas ahavo unay. And he says 200 pirushim. And fire descends from heaven, and the fire surrounds Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Eliezer. All the others are outside the perimeter of the fire, and only the two of them are within. And when Rabbi Eliezer finishes darshaning, the fire subsides, Rabbi Eliezer or Levisara Hashemayim. So that's the end of the story, and it is told in the Zohar. So Rabbi Kiva responds, Rabbi, let's learn. Teach us Torah. One could interpret this passage in two different ways. Maybe Rabbi Kiva hoped, maybe in the schus of Torah, we will be salvaged. You know, Torah is Moira Rachamim. You know, we hear such a terrible prophecy. You know, so maybe we have some takara. Let's learn Torah. Maybe Torah is mantik dinin. Maybe Torah could turn things around. Maybe. That's a reasonable pshat. But maybe pshat is just, okay, so we just heard some terrible news. So let's take advantage of the time that we've got. Obviously, we did a terrible mistake that we weren't mishamish Rabbi Eliezer. So let's try to make up for it as much as we can. So we don't know when this will all happen, when these tragedies will transpire. They were all Haruge Malchus ultimately. So Rabbi Kiva just says, so let's take advantage of the time that we do have and start teaching us now. And that was Rabbi Kiva's response. So whenever tragedy strikes us, let's make the most. Let's make the most of it. I mean, we were spared, Baruch Hashem, and we are alive, so let's dedicate every moment we have to teach Torah, to learn Torah, to disseminate Torah. So that's why we're here right now in the base of Medrash. Yaakov Avinu promises for HaKadosh Baruch when he says, whatever you give me, I will give Meiser. And the Gemara in Ksubas Daf Nun Amud Aleph, based on this pasuk, the Gemara says, B'usha hetkinu, one of the tekonos that were constituted in Usha, a great assembly of Gedolei Yisrael in the early days of the Tanuim, B'usha hetkinu, hamavazvez, al yavazvez yosim achaymish. You shouldn't give tzedakah more than 20% of what you have. How did Chazal reach a conclusion of 20%? Aser ha'asrenu loch, twice Meiser. Twice Meiser is 20%. Meiser is 10%. So if the Pasuk uses dual language, Aser ha'asrenu loch, that's what Yaakov Avinu said. Hamabazviz, al yavazviz, yoisam achoymish. On one hand, the Gemara says, B'usha hitkinu. So obviously this is a derabanan. It's not a diuraisa. It is one of the tekanas of the assembly in Usha. It is based on a pasuk, so obviously the pasuk is only what we define as an asmachta. It's not a real drush. It's not a diuraisa. Sometimes Chazal said what they said. They were mechadish, whatever they were mechadish, and they based it on what we would define probably in English a certain link, but not more than that. The remez. And that is what we define as asmachta, but obviously we're dealing with the Rabbanan. Which brings us to think, so what was the din before Tekanas Usha? In Usha, they made a Tekana, a person should not give more than 20% of what he has for Tzedakah. So what was the situation, what was the halacha? What was the psak before this Tekana was put into place in Usha? Surprisingly, we find an interesting tshuva Sam Sofer, Yoredesim Maresh Chov Testach, Sam Sofer says, Mena Torah, person has to give whatever he has for tzedakah. There is no limit. It is only Tekana Susha. Shelo Ya'ani V'yatil Atzmei Al Tzibur. If a person will give away whatever he has, then what's the point? I support others, and tomorrow those others will have to support me, and that's why in Usha they instituted the Tekana, a decree that a person should not spend more than 20% of his possession for tzedakah. So the Chassam Sofer seems to maintain that this Tekana is based on the basic rule, Yesh koyach biyad chachomim lakor duva min haTorah b'sheva al taisa. Chachomim can't override the diuraisa b'kum v'asei. Chachomim don't have the power, they don't have the authority to say that a person should violate a mitzvah diuraisa in an active fashion. But they do have authority to say in passive way, you do not have to perform a mitzvah diuraisa. So according to the Chassam Sofer, when they said, it is based on the rule that yesh koach biyad chachumim lakar duva min haTorah b'sheva al taisa. A similar approach, similar but not the same, we find in the Netziv. The Netziv in Bava Kama Daf Tesel Mid Beis, in the Chidushim of the Netziv and Shas, the Netziv says that the basis of this ruling, which is Kvoida Brius. And Kvoida Brius is Doicha Aloises Min haTorah. And the Gemara makes it very clear in Brochos of Chafam Medalef. Kvoida Brius is only Doicha Sheval Taisa, not a Kum V'asei. So, the chashash that a person will fall as a burden on the community actually is Kvoida Brius. It is very difficult for people to accept and live with a fall in their social standing. So Kvoida Brius is Doicha Ediuraisa B'Sheval Taisa, and that is the authority Chachamim to say you do not have to spend more than 20% of what you have for tzedakah. Atzadeh Shava Shebishneim, the common denominator between the Chassam Sofer and the Netziv, even though it's a slightly different approach, but both assume Both assume that before Tikkun Susha, there was no limit on what you have to spend. Something that, in my opinion, is extremely unreasonable. Extremely unreasonable to say that Menatayra, the din is a person has to spend all he has to support others. I think it basically doesn't make sense. I have to give away whatever I have to support others, and tomorrow those others will have to give away whatever they have now to support me. Doesn't make sense. So how do we understand Takonas Usha? So what was the situation before the Takona? And when I have reservations about this pshat, it is not only based on Savorim, I think it's also based on a Gemon Bava Kama Testament days. I quoted the Netziv is on the Chidushim and Bava Kama. So what do we have in Bava Kama? The Gemara says in Bava Kama, Hidu mitzvah ad, b'mitzvah ad shlish. A person has to spend a shlish, a third, to perform mitzvahs. And this is the halacha which isn't defined. You have to spend a third to perform mitzvahs. Which mitzvahs? And a third of what? So the Gemara says, if pshat might be that you have to give away a third of whatever you possess, a third of your money, to perform a mitzvah, then what will happen if a person is confronted with 3 mitzvahs at the same time? You know, come to shul in the morning, and I have to buy daled minim, yeah? And there's a poor man stretching out his hand, and I have to build a sukkah as well. So a third for the sukkah, third for the lulim and the esrog, third for tzedakah. The Gemara says, then he's not going to be left with any money. So the Gemara says, no, this is impossible. This cannot be. So the interpretation of the Gemara, which is actually halachic ruling, Sif and Shulchan, you have to spend a third of the cost of the mitzvah to be mahader in that very same mitzvah. That means if I could buy an esrog for 100 shekel, and there is a far more beautiful esrog, a more mahudadik esrog, for 150 shekel, no, I do not have to add 50% to have a nicer esrog. But if I could get the better esrog for 130 shekel, which is adding a third, then I am obliged to do so. So the interpretation in the maskana of the sugya is behidu mitzvah ad shlish b'mitzvah. You have to add a third to the basic cost to perform the same mitzvah in a more mehudadik fashion. So Tosfos argues the kasha of the Gemara, Ilias amalei klosa mitzvah bahada hadada. If a person will be confronted with 3 mitzvahs at the same time, does that mean he was rich 5 minutes ago, and now he is poor because he had to be makayim 3 mitzvahs? So the prince turns a pauper at once because he has 3 mitzvahs to perform. So the Gemara makes it very clear. This is impossible. So I think the same argument would be antekonas usha. So minatayra, does a person have to give away everything he has to perform 1 mitzvah for tzedakah? It is very unreasonable. The same argument the Gemara says, and Gemara makes in Bava Kama Testament base, is valid regarding the Chasam Sofer and the Netziv.
Maybe 30%, 40%, not everything. So Tkonas Usha says 20%.
So that is the question. Minat Torah, how much does a person have to spend? What you say is just a guess. Just a guess. The only definitive number we find is Chaimish. That is the Tkonas Usha. So the Chasam Sofer and the Netziv both argue Minat Torah. Well, more than a Chaimish. How much? How much more? So my feeling would be this. It is poshet beineinu. It is to be taken for granted and to be assumed, and naturally assumed, that there is a limit how much a person has to spend for a mitzvah. But as many other fields of halacha, nimsar hadovar lechacham, and it was up to chachamim to determine a certain limit. Because in Minat Torah, there are many halachas that aren't specified and clearly defined. In the Gemara Bava Kama, the Tes, all the Gemara says, it's impossible that a person has to spend a third of all his money for a mitzvah. Why can't that be? Why is it unreasonable? Because if he's confronted with 3 mitzvahs, that means he's without a penny in his pocket. So would a person say, oh, a third is really not reasonable? So let's say 20%. So the same question would arise once again. So if he has 5 mitzvahs, would be the same question. So if he's confronted with 5 mitzvahs, so once again, he's left without money to provide for his family, to perform mitzvahs today and tomorrow and a day after tomorrow. Same question. And therefore, it is clear to us that there is a limit to what a person has to spend for tzedakah. V'nimsar hadol l'chacham. And chachamim, it is their duty and their privilege to define and to set fixed rules and specific guidelines to each and every mitzvah of the Torah. Nimsar hadol l'chachamim, and chachamim found a remez and a smachta in the pasuk in this week's parsha, Aser Eslen Eloch, and they were metaken al yevazvez yosam machosh. The Yerushalmi, in the beginning of Masechtas Peah, the Yerushalmi says, Halacha hoysa biyodam v'shachachuhu, and ba'usha chazru v'yizduho. The Gra, Shnoi Seliyahu, that's the Parish of the Gra Mishnayis. And we find the same in Shuvas Maharam Shik, the great disciple of the Samsofi Yodeis and Mareish Lamed. Their interpretation of the Yerushalmi is it's Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's actually the Uraisa. Like many Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So the Shia of Chaimish actually is Menatayra. So why do Chazal say Ba'usha Etkinu? It was for God. And in Usha, they restored the original Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So the formulation, the lesson we find in the Yerushalmi is Halacha hoyso biyodam v'shachachoh. So the Gaon and the Maram Shik both understand Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But we find this same formulation in Yerushalmi in various different sugyas where it is very clear that the Kavan is not Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. For instance, first Perek in Shabbos, Gzeres Yud Ches Davar. Yud Ches Davar is a lengthy sugya in Shabbos Daf Yud Zayin. And it is very clear that we're dealing with many rabbinical decrees, Gzeres and Konas Chachamim. And it is there that we once again find the Yerushalmi, Halacha hoysa biyodam v'shachachoh, and Chazru v'yizduho. So when the Yerushalmi says Halacha hoysa biyodam, it doesn't necessarily mean Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the Uraisa, but rather that this is an ancient halacha from previous generations. It was forgotten, and then it was once again restored. Even when the Yerushalmi says Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, not always is the Kavanah Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, as we find in Masechet Kilayim, Davav Amid Beis, Hagaot Tzion v'Yerushalayim, from Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzan and his brother-in-law Rabbi Mordechai Zev Ettinger. And this is a story I do not recall whether I told you. Those were 2 Gidolei Hador. Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzan is the famous Shoel HaMeshiv, one of the greatest halachic rulers in the Tkufa of Achronim. He was 17-year-old when he got married into the Orenstein Ettinger family, which was a very choshev and miyuchas family in Galicia. And he and his brother-in-law, who was 4 years older than him, wrote about 10 Sforim together. The first sefer they produced when Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzan was 17 years old. And it's really a godlish sefer. Are you familiar with the Mogen Gebayim? The Mishnah Berurah quotes him in almost every sif in Shulchan Aruch Chaim. Mogen Gebayim. Mogen Gebayim is one of the Sforim written by Rabbi Yosef Shol and Rabbi Mordechai Zev. They wrote this sefer together, and Rabbi Yosef Shol Natanzan was 20 years old when he wrote that sefer. And it has become a classic in halachic ruling, and the Mishnah Berurah quotes him almost in every sif. So they have a Gos and Yerushalmi, Kalayim Davav Amid Beis. They prove from various different sources that sometimes, even when the Yerushalmi says Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, it doesn't really mean Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, the Uraisa, but rather Halacha that was put into place by previous generations. It was forgotten throughout the ages and then restored once again. And therefore, I think the Shia of a Chaimish is Takana Susha. So what was the din before Takana Susha? The din wasn't defined. It was clear because it cannot be differently. A person doesn't have to spend all his money on tzedakah. That is unreasonable. Because then every day there are going to be other Bali tzedakah. And people, and money will switch hands from Pliny to Almoni, and from Almoni back to Pliny, and from Pliny to Palmoni, and then from Palmoni back to Almoni, or to Pliny. We get confused. But that is extremely unreasonable. So it's poshut that minatoila, a person has to give some of his money to tzedakah. But minatoila, it's not defined. And that is the concept of nimsar hadava lachacham. The chachamim were those, Chazal, in the golden era of Torah Shabal Peh, Bizman HaMishnah VaGamor, and they defined and regulated many mitzvahs d'oraisa, and that is our understanding. And this brings us to a very, very relevant question. Is this the Kohen referring only to tzedakah or to expenses on mitzvahs in general? So in Ksubas Tafnun and Bavli, it is very clear, according to the Bavli, this takana refers to tzedakah. How much money does a person have to give to tzedakah? On one hand, we find a concept of Maisik Sofim, which is 10%. Where is this concept found? Nowhere in Bavli. It's not a Bavli. Nowhere in Yerushalmi. It's neither a Bavli nor a Yerushalmi. Toises and Tanas Daftes brings it from Sifro. It's not a Bavli or Yerushalmi. It's not a Suki. But Toises brings it in Masechet Tanas Daftes. What we do find is Avazas, Ali Avazas, Yoisem Achoimish. Yoisem Achoimish for what? So in Bavli, it seems to be very clear tzedakah. But the Roshon of Yerushalmi, Resh Masechet Peah. And Peah Daf Aleph and Daf Beis in Yerushalmi. The formulation is Bu'ushe Hitkinu Shiehei Odom Mafresh Choimish Nachosov Lemitzvah. And there are two very clear distinctions and differences between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. The Bavli speaks about tzedakah. Yerushalmi speaks about mitzvah. However, this is a very good example. Sometimes to have proper understanding, you need to have a broader overview and more bekiyas. Whenever the Yerushalmi writes mitzvah, the kavona is tzedakah. Mitzvah in Yerushalmi means tzedakah, and not general mitzvahs. That is what we find in Yerushalmi Peah, Lamed Zayin Amid Beis. Peah has 37 dafim in Yerushalmi. So, at the beginning of the Masechet, the first daf, Chazal say, B'ushet kinu shi'ayoda mafresh choyvish menchosav lemitzvah. The end of Masechet Peah, Lamed Zayin Amid Beis, we find in the Yerushalmi that one of the Ameroim lo have a palag lemitzvah b'leir. He used to give tzedakah only by day and not by night. So the Lashon of the Yerushalmi is mitzvah, and it is obvious that the kavona is tzedakah, and that is also what we find in Yerushalmi Shkolim, Chav Gimel Amid Beis and Megillah Chav Dalad Amid Dalad. So we have three different sources in Yerushalmi. When the Yerushalmi says mitzvah, the kavona is tzedakah, and therefore there is no basis to say that there is a machlokes Bavli in Yerushalmi regarding other mitzvahs. However, there's another difference which is quite obvious between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. While this halacha in the Bavli is a negative formulation, in the Yerushalmi it is a positive one. The Bavli says, "B'ushit kilu hamavazvez al yevazvez yoisem achoymish." He should not spend more than 20%. While the Yerushalmi says, "B'ushit kilu shiahei ha'odam mafresh choymish menachosav lemitzvah." So the Yerushalmi speaks about a positive precept, a positive idea. A person should set aside 20%. There's a famous letter of the Gra, and the Gra says a person has to give 20% for tzedakah. However, the lesson of the Bavli is don't give more than 20%, which seems to indicate you're not mechuyev to give 20%, but don't give more. So the Yerushalmi could be the basis for the Gra's shittim, because the Yerushalmi says, "Bu'ushet kinu shiahei ha'adam mafresh choymish menachosav lemitzvah." So this idea in Yerushalmi is presented in a positive fashion, while in Bavli it is presented in a negative way. So how about other mitzvahs? How much does a person have to spend to perform a mitzvah? This halacha we find in Shulchan Aruch Chaim Siman Tov Reish Nun Vav. Everybody remembers. What are the halachas in Tov Reish Nun Vav? Dinam of Daled Minim. So, the Rama says, Eina Odam Chayev Lebazbez Hoin Rav Ala Mitzvahs. You do not have to spend a fortune on mitzvahs. How much do we have to spend? What the Rama says, Ein Odam Chayev Lebazbez Hoin Rav Ala Mitzvahs. How does one define Hoin Rav in English? A lot of money. You know, in slang, we would say you don't have to spend a fortune. What's a fortune? It's a relative concept. So the Messiah Yosef quotes Rabbeinu Yeruchim. Rabbeinu Yeruchim was one of the great Rishonim. And he says, you have to spend Maisa, a tenth. That is the idea of Maisa Ksuvim. And the Messiah Yosef said, V'lo yodati menayin lo. I don't know where he picked this up. That's the comment of the Messiah Yosef. Quoting Rabbeinu Yeruchim, that you have to spend a tenth, and he wonders, the Beis Yosef, where did Rabbeinu Yeruchim see that a person has to spend a tenth of his fortune to perform one given mitzvah? Lo yodati minayin lo. That's the comment of the Beis Yosef regarding Rabbeinu Yeruchim. Many achronim maintain chomish, a fifth. That is the Bach in Siman Tov Reish Nun Vav. Chayodom, Klal Chof Aleph, Siv Yud Gimel. Shuvas Mari Asad, Siman Reish Beis. These are some of the greatest Gedolim. And they are machmir. You have to spend 20% for one given mitzvah. But the Beis Yosef quotes the Rabbeinu Yeruchim, they have to spend 10%, and Rabbi Yosef says, where did he get that? Lo yodati menayin lo. The Pri Halacha Tov Reish Nun Vav wants to say Pshat in the Beis Yosef, Lo yodati menayin lo. Who says 10%? Maybe 20%. So that is the comment of the Beis Yosef and Rabbeinu Yeruchim. But when we learn Rabbeinu Yeruchim and we learn the Beis Yosef, it's quite obvious that that's not the kavanah of the Beis Yosef. Because the Beis Yosef quotes Rabbeinu Yeruchim saying that a person is chayiv lahoitzi isa nachosav ala mitzvah. So Rabbeinu Yeruchim doesn't say he is potter for giving a chaimish. Rabbeinu Yeruchim doesn't say he doesn't have to give more than 10%. If Rabbeinu Yeruchim would say you don't have to give more than 10%, and the Beis Yosef would comment, how does he know? Then the proper interpretation would be like the Bialocha. You have to give 20%, not 10%. But the Beis Yosef quotes Rabbeinu Yeruchim. And Rabbeinu Yeruchim writes, narrowly, that a person has to give 10%. And if the Beis Yosef says, how does he know? That means 10% is too much, not too little. And not the way the Bialoch understands the Beis Yosef. And therefore my opinion is, so if I would be alone out there, disputing the Rabbeinu Yeruchim and the Mishnah Brura and the Chayodam and the Yehuda Asad and the Bach, I would feel extremely uncomfortable. But one of the great Achronim says what I say, and I think he's right, that that's the Mama Mordechai. Mama Mordechai is one of the great Achronim, and in Tov Reish Nun Vav, Siv Koten Gimel, Mama Mordechai says. And I think he definitely is right. If the Rama would think there is a number, he would share that number with us. And if he doesn't, that means there is no number. I just want to add on to the Mama Mordechai. In Siman Reish Mem Tes and Yoradeh and Hilchas Tzedakah, the Rama does give a figure when he quotes the halacha of Tekon HaSusha. So why doesn't he define in Shulchan Aruch Chaim, where we're not dealing with tzedakah, but rather with mitzvahs? How much does a person have to spend? And therefore, my opinion is, And that is the shit of the Mama Mordechai. By Tzedakah, Chazal give a certain number. Either a tenth, which is Maisek Sovim, or a fifth, which is based on Tikkun Susha. Because it is reasonable, and it makes sense. All you have to spend for Tzedakah is 10% or 20%, and everything is included. You divide it as you wish. For the kollel, for the yeshiva, for Achnas Skala, helping your kids in kollel, supporting, various causes, choshev causes. Divide it up as you wish. But the lump sum is 10% to 20% of your ravachim. Regarding mitzvahs, it's far more complicated because there are tayyag mitzvahs, and you don't know what's coming up. That is exactly the dilemma the Gemara talks about in Bava Kamet Tesomit Beis. So if I'll have 3 mitzvahs at once, so what? Prince becomes pauper, he has to spend all his money. I think the same argument is valid whether it's a tenth or a fifth or whatever it is. What is the difference between a shlish or 20% or 10%? And therefore, when the Ramah says, Ein Odom Chayev Lebas B'Z Hoin Rav Ala Mitzvahs, Hoin Rav is a totally relative concept. Depends what the reasonable cost of a mitzvah would be. Paying $150 for an Arava is a Hoin Rav. Probably so. Paying $150 to build a sukkah is a bargain. So would we say $150 is a fortune? We don't have to spend $150 on a mitzvah. Depends what the mitzvah is. Depends what the reasonable cost, what the realistic cost is. Maybe it depends how much money you have. And that is lahedya in the Ram. The Ram, dealing with Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Sheva that paid 1,000 zuz for an esrei, the Ram writes called echod lefi memoine. So it depends how much you have. And it also depends on the nature of the mitzvah. What is the reasonable cost? So $1,000 could be a very big price for some mitzvahs. So does a person have to spend $1,000 for Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? Well, that's a big bargain. To move from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael for $1,000, well, nobody made that mitzvah for $1,000. So when the Ramah writes, Ein Odom Chayev Lebas B'Z Hoin Rav, the Ramah intentionally uses that Hagdolah, that definition. Because regarding mitzvahs, no, there is no number. There is no number. Neither 10% nor 20%. It depends what is reasonable. As I said, we need Dalad Minim. $100 for an Arova is definitely a Hoin Rav. $100 for the package? Well, maybe it's cheap. It's a bargain for a good Esed and a good Lolav and a good Hadassam and good Arovas. So Hoin Rav is a relative concept. And that is the opinion of the Mama Mordechai, and I think he's right. I think he's right because of Svora, as I just explained. But there's a different reason as well. This Ramah is based on Toisus and Bava Kamet Esum Beis. When the Gemara asks, is it possible? You say a person has to plan the shlish for a mitzvah, 3 mitzvahs at once, leaves him penniless. Toisus writes, it is here that we know, Ein Odom Chayev Lebas B'Z Kol Hoinoi Ala Mitzvahs. So Toisus writes, Kol Hoinoi. The Ramah modifies that formulation, that definition, and he writes, Ein Odom Chayev Lebas B'Z Hoin Rav. None of the Rishonim besides the Beini Yeruchim say how much do you have to spend to perform a mitzvah. All the Rishonim quote Toisus. You don't have to spend all your money or a great deal of money to perform a mitzvah. Stimas HaRishonim is more powerful than Pirushi Achronim. So this is a principle I quote quite often. 3 of the great Achronim make the same point. The Beis Meir was one of the greatest Achronim, living 250 years ago. And the Beis Meir, or Chaim Simon Tov Mem Gimel, we also find the tshuva of the Beis Meir quoted in Chachma Sod of the Chai Olam quotes. He writes, Yofa b'yeinai lilmoid m'stimas harashonim asher mepirushei achronim. Stimas harashonim is very powerful. And the fact that all the Rishonim say, you don't have to spend a fortune on mitzvahs, and none of the Rishonim says, so how much do we have to spend? that proves that there is no number. It's relative. Depends on your means, and it depends if it's a reasonable price or not. The same rule we find in Beis Shlomo. Beis Shlomo, one of the greatest poskim in Galicia. The Chazon Ish was a big chassid of the Beis Shlomo. He was Rav in Skol, which is a town in Galicia, and the Sefer is a magnificent Sefer. Rav Shlomo Dermer was his name. Shalos Hashuvas Beis Shlomo Chelik Beis Siman Mem, and last but not least is the Chazon Ish Shvias Siman Zayin. The Chazon Ish says a shaila that is a milta de shchicha, a common shaila, and it is not addressed by the poskim throughout the ages. Ilu hoyuze alocha psuka hoyuze lereishis choyvosom lefarish, and if they did not do so, proves that there is no such alocha. And the Chazon Ish writes, Zu etzli ha'achroa ha'yesero mekol harayis. There is no raya that is more convincing than Stimas Rishonim. So in all the Rishonim deal with the question of expenses to perform mitzvahs. And they all say you don't have to spend a fortune in the performance of mitzvahs. And besides the Ben Yeruchah, none of them says how much do you have to spend. That means there is no definitive figure. We can't say how much percent you have to spend. It is what it is. The Ramon Hilchas Tzedakah writes Chaimish. That is dealing with Hilchas Tzedakah. Dealing with mitzvahs, Ein Odom Chayav Lebazbez Hon Harav. To me, it is quite obvious. He didn't go beyond that because we cannot go beyond that. And the argument is a very simple one. If a person has to spend 30% or 20% or 10% on each and every mitzvah, then 10 mitzvahs, he's left without any means, not reasonable, cannot be. And therefore, when Ramon says, Ein Odom Chayav Lebazbez Rav, it is what it is. Ein Odom Chayav Lebazbez Hon Rav Ala Mitzvahs. I would like to examine the Shittas HaRambam in this entire sugya. So if I could just be matriach someone, I need a Rambam Hafloa and Matnas Aniyim. We do not find this halacha in the Rambam, which is a big surprise. We do not find this halacha in Rambam. Zroim and Hafloa. However, we do find two halachas in Rambam. In one of the two, the Rambam does mention the concept of Chaimish. Perek Zayin Matnas Aniyim, halacha Hey, is one source. The last halacha in Hilchas Erechim is the second source. I think it's Erechim Perek Chet halacha Yud Gimel. But besides these two halachas in Rambam, what is very significant is the Perush Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Masechet Peah. In the first Mishnah in Masechet Peah, the Rambam does address the question of Chaimish, and the Rambam writes, Al Yevazez Yosem HaChaimish. However, it is a midas chasidus to spend more than a Chaimish, which is surprising. Because of Chazal say, Amavazvez, Al Yevazvez Yosem HaChaimish, and the Rambam comes along and he says, however, it is a midas chasidus to spend more than a Chaimish. So why do Chazal say one should not spend more than a Chaimish? That is in Perush HaMishnah. The Chavis Yor, who was one of the greatest poskim 300 years ago, says that probably the Rambam means a person that's very rich. So if you're fabulously rich, well, you have $500 million, maybe $100 million, maybe $50 million as well, then this halacha doesn't apply to you. Al Yevazvez Yosem HaChaimish. How much do you need to live till the end of your days and take care of your children and your nephews and nieces? Well, what do you expect to do with all the rest? Do mitzvahs. So the Chavis Yor says, when the Rambam says midas chasidus to spend more than a chaimish, he's speaking with a person that's taken care of. He has enough for his expenses and needs, and what do you do with all the rest? You should believe that you're a Gavit Tzedakah, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you all this wealth. You should do Ma'is and Toiv. So the Rambam in Perek Zayin Alocha Hey of Hilchas Matnas Aniyim, the Rambam writes, Bo oni v'shoal daimak soiroi. Poor man comes along and he asks for support. Ve'ein yada noisin maseges. And it's more than I could afford. Noisin lo kefi asoges yada. Give him as much as you can. Ve'kamo ad choimish menachosov mitzvah min hamuvchar. The Rambam writes, till 20% is mitzvah min hamuvchar. It's not an obligation. You don't have to give 20%. But ad choimish menachosov mitzvah min hamuvchar. Echod ma'asora benachosov beinoni. Pochas mekan ayin ra. That is the formulation of the Rambam. A tenth, beinoni. Ad choimish mitzvah min hamuvchar. This is for one ani. An ani comes along and asks for support. The Rambam at the end of Hilchas Eirachin, Perek Ches Alochi Yud Gimel, and I'm learning the entire halacha. Lo elam lo yagdish odom lo yachrim kol nachosav u'oiseh zeh over al das hakosuv. Sharei u'oimer mi kol asheloi v'lo kol asheloi. Mi kol asheloi v'lo kol asheloi. Ve'ein zu chasidus ereshtus. Sharei zeh ma'abed kol memoina v'yitztalach lebriot. Ve'ein marachamim alav. U'bezer ki yoytze bayom rechachomim choset shoyte machlal mechal yoylo. So Rambam uses very harsh language towards those that spend all they have and they don't care for their own future for a rainy day. Elo, kol ha-mefaze memoinoi b'mitzvahs al yefaze yoyse mechoymish. Kol ha-mefaze memoinoi b'mitzvahs al yefaze yoyse mechoymish. So it is quite obvious in the Rambam, he is not speaking about tzedakah necessarily. He's speaking generally about mitzvahs. He doesn't say you have to give a chomish. He says, don't give more than a chomish. V'yeh k'moishe tzevu hanaviyim mechalkel dvorov b'mishpot bein b'divrei Torah bein b'divrei Olam v'afilu b'korbanot shodom chayev behem chosa Torah al mamonim shel Yisrael v'omro kefi masas yodoi kal v'chomer advom shelonos chayev behem שלא ינדרה קרוי לו ישכה מתנס יודוי כברכס השם על כבו אשר נוסע לו. So the Rambam here doesn't say you need to give a chomish. He said, Al yifaz yoysim a chomish. However, in Hilchas Matnas Anim, he says, chomish mitzvah min hamuvchar. My feeling is that the Rambam maintains that chomish is not a chiyuv. It's a midas chasidus. As he writes in Perasha Mishnah, sometimes Midas Chasidus goes beyond. And when they were metaken b'usha, al yivazuz yoysim a chomish doesn't mean you need to give a chomish. Chomish is mitzvah min hamuvchar. It is not an obligation. So the Rambam in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim doesn't write you need to give a chomish, but ad and that is when there is an immediate need. We need to support someone who is desperate. If many people support him, then we split it between us. If it is only I that could support him, then chomish mitzvah min hamuvchar. At the end of Hilchas Eirachin, the Rambam writes al yitni yoysim a chomish. Hilchas Eirachin is the end of Sefer HaFloah. And as we know, the custom of the Rambam, when he finishes off a Sefer, he usually finishes off with Divrei Chasidus and Divrei Musar and Divrei Machshava. And that is why at the end of Hilchas Eirachin, the Rambam writes this halacha, which is the general approach of Bnei Yisrael to mitzvahs and maas and tov. Don't go to extremes. Shemi etztarach al abrius, ve'ein marachamim. So don't go to extremes. So basically the Rambam feels that there is no chiyuv to give a chomish, but what is obvious in the Rambam in the end of Hilchas Eirachin is the Rambam does use chaimish not only in Hilchas Tzedakah, but as a general guideline to how much money we need to spend on mitzvahs as well. So today we dealt with a very important and basic sugya, which we all think about many times, because the needs of our communities are great, and everybody grapples with the question, how much should I give, how much could I give, how much am I obliged to give? But mitzvah tzedakah and gemilas chasadim is one of the three pillars of the world. So we need to make an effort to give as much as we can give, and it is also important the way we give and the fashion in which we give. As Chazal teach us, I mentioned at the beginning of the Shia the tragedy that befell us all last week, Tuesday morning. And this is a mega tragedy. And the images we have seen brought back horrible memories. Memories that we thought we will never have to witness again. Seeing people in talis and in tefillin being butchered, not only killed, but butchered in such a brutal, barbaric fashion. Which brings us back to pictures from the Holocaust, from the pogroms in the Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, pictures from Hebron in Tarpat, horrible images and pictures and memories. When I visited the families, which was extremely moving to me personally, I quoted a medrash that we find in Koheles in Perek Gimel. The medrash says, "Misoira zu yehei biyad. Kol ha'oisek b'mitzvah samoch l'misasor." If a person is engaged in a mitzvah before his demise, before he perishes, harei ze doime ki'ilu lo yehoisu midas tzidkosei chasero elo mitzvah zu v'bo v'hishlima. If a person passes from this world while he's engaged in a mitzvah, it is as if Kodesh Baruch Hu testifies that all he was lacking is this one mitzvah. Bo v'hishlima v'ala v'sara hashamayim. So these tzaddikim, nafsham yotzu v'dabra, while being in a Mokum Kodesh, this is our holy sanctuary, the Beis Mikdash Ma'at. We have nothing that is holier and more precious than a shul. In shul with talis and tefillin, which is a tremendous chus, but that doesn't lessen the tragedy. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu could be noikev dam, nikmas dam, avodav hashofuch, Hashem yinkom dam. Ki dam avodav yukom, v'nokem yoshev letzora v'chiper ad mosayam. So on one hand, with all the natural anger and wrath we have on these barbarians, on the other hand, we have to do a cheshbon nefesh. The great Tana Rabbi Akiva says in Perek Gimel, Mishnah Tezvov and Mesechet Avos, Hakol Safui v'harashus nesuna. And it is only once that the Rambam is moved and inspired and is spoiled. Very uncommon for the Rambam. And the Rambam says, Zah mamar koilol dvorim gedoylem ha'oid v'ra'ui v'Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. The Rambam says only Rabbi Akiva could make such a profound statement. And I say, only the Rambam could compliment Rabbi Akiva for the profound statement that he made. So on one hand, everything is predestined and predetermined. Nothing could happen in this world if it's not a Kodesh Baruch Hu's will. But that does in no way diminish the liability and responsibility of human beings. On one hand, we have Bechira. Ish becheto yumas v'rashoim tiradof ra. But on the other hand, we believe that everything is predetermined. These people, time has come for them to go up to Gan Eden, to go home, to face their destiny. Kodesh Baruch Hu wanted them up there. In no way does that diminish the horror of these murderers. So we are required to do cheshbon nefesh, because the Rambam writes in the first halacha in Al-Chastanius, Mitzvah sasei shel Torah lizoik v'laharia al kol tzorei shetovei al yisor. And the Rambam goes on in halacha Gimel to say, Ve'im lo yezaku ve'lo yariu v'yomru. It is coincidence. Hareizu derech exorius. V'tova yitzor azu tzarot acherot. Kodesh Baruch Hu speaks to us. And when tragedy strikes, He is demanding. And He wants us to listen. And the Rambam interprets the pasuk, Im telchu imi b'keri, ani elech imochem b'chamat keri. Keri is a lotion of mikra, coincidence. If you will not take to heart, and you will merely say, and dismiss my call to you, and you will say, well, it happens. Things like this happen. They happen in Japan, they happen in Korea, they happen in Russia. It happens. No. Things don't just happen. Things happen when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants them to happen, and therefore it is incumbent upon us lizoik v'laharia, and to do a cheshbon nefesh. Lo novi ani v'lo ben novi. I'm not a prophet. And when people ask me all day, so what is it exactly that we have to be mitaken? I think everybody should know where he is lacking and what he has to be mitaken. But generally, I think there are the yesodis which Chazal teach us are ma'orer rachamei shema. I think when terrible tragedy strikes us, the first chizik we need is in emunah and in ahavas Hashem. The pasuk says, "V'yodato im lavavecho, ki ka'asher yiyaser ish et beno Hashem Elokecho miyasorecho." Like a father punishes his children out of love, or a mother. Ki ka'asher yiyaser ish et beno Hashem Elokecho miyasorecho. And a Parshas Re'ei, when the pasuk says, "Boni matem l'Hashem Elokechem, lo yisis goyim, v'lo tasimu krochem eneinechem l'meis," the Ramban says, you are a Kodesh Baruch Hu's children. And a Kodesh Baruch Hu loves us more than a father loves his children. A Kodesh Baruch Hu loves us more than a father loves his children. How much more? I wonder, how much more? Well, whenever we speak in allegory, b'derech moshel u'melitza, we necessarily have to use terms we are familiar with. So we know of no greater love than a love of a father to his children, parents to their children. So when we look for a moshel, how does the Kodesh Baruch Hu's love to us manifest itself? The pasuk says, "Boni matem l'Hashem Elokechem," like children. The Ramban says the Kodesh Baruch Hu loves us more than a father could ever love his children. How much more? 1,000,000 times? 1,000,000,000 times? Infinitely more. Because the Kodesh Baruch Hu is infinite. Ein sof. But we need to feel and not only believe. Ki ka'asher yiyaser ish et beno Hashem Elokecho miyasorecho. That is what Rabbi Kiva taught us when he said, "Kol di Ovid Rachmon eletav Ovid." And Rabbi Kiva was a disciple of Nochem ish Gamzu, that Al Kol Tzorei Shalei Tov said Gamzu l'Tov. When a person says Kabbalas O Malchus Shemayim, you cover your eyes when you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hashem Elokeinu are two different names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. One indicative of Midas Adin. Elokim is Midas Adin, while Havai is Midas Arachamim. So we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. Ultimately, Hashem Echad. And Midas Adin, in a way, is also Midas Arachamim. But we don't see that. And that is why we cover our eyes when we make this statement. Yes? It's difficult to see. But we believe. That is what we were taught. And we believe, Ki ka'asher yaseh rishet beno Hashem Elokecho miyasreko, and when we hurt, HaKadosh Baruch Hu feels our pain in an infinite way. More than we could feel the pain of our beloved children. And this is what we believe, and this is what keeps us going. And this is what was so obvious when I visited these 4 wonderful families in Harlem. We need to be mischazik in Torah, because the Mishnah says, Mar b'Torah, Mar b'chaim. Ki hi chayechem v'orech yomechem. Torah is life. And in Soita Daf Chof Aleph, the Gemara says, Torah more than any other mitzvah is aguni magni u'metzila matzli. Torah gives us security more than any other mitzvah. So many times we are accustomed to hear from Darshanim, from Rabbanim, never did Klal Yisrael learn as much Torah as it does today. Never was there a generation of so many Lumdim as we have today. If we are so great, why are we so pained? Why does tragedy strike us? We believe in Din Shemayim. So obviously we're not as great as we sometimes think we are. And I think that each and every one of us, when he does his own personal cheshbon nefesh, al mishkavoi beleilot, we could all do more. We could all learn more. And I'm quite confident about that. There are still many Eden amongst us that aren't kaveyetim l'Torah. And those that are kaveyetim l'Torah could learn far more than they are learning. I think so. I think that I could learn more than I'm learning. And I think that everybody would feel that in his own Seidion. So we need to renew our dedication and our devotion to Torah. We need to daven more. Because when tragedy strikes, that's what the Rambam says, Lizoig v'lahariya. Tefillah is defined as rachamim. And that is the Gemara in Brochas Chafum and Beis. The Gemara says, L'chayra, women should be exempt from the mitzvah of Tefillah. It's a mitzvah to say Shas Mangrama. But the Gemara says that is impossible. Because Tefillah is rachamim. Is anybody in this world not in need of rachamim shemayim? So Tefillah is the tool. Tefillah is the means to be zocheh to rachamim shemayim. So the Gemara says, regardless of the rule, no shema poter mitzvah sheish mangrama, but Tefillah is rachamim. There cannot be any Jew that's potter from Tefillah because we all need rachamim shemayim. And when tragedy strikes, mitzvahs essential Torah lizoig v'lahariya, and to cry before a Kodesh Baruch Hu, Misha Amar Olam Idai Yoim Alatzoro Seimudai. And we need to do far more in Ahavas Reim and Ahavas Yisrael. Being more tolerant one towards another, in the personal level and the communal level, far more Ahavas Yisrael. The Netziv writes in his unbelievable introduction to the Hamek Davar and Chamisha Chumash Torah, speaking about Churban Bayis Sheni. In Yom Tes, the Gemara says Churban Bayis Sheni was caused by sinas chinam. So the Netziv writes, they were tzadikim, chasidim, va'ameloi Torah. What could be greater than that? Tzadikim v'chasidim v'amelei Torah. But they were lacking in midas and in yashas halichoseim, and they had sinas chinam. And each of them thought that anybody that has a different opinion than he has isn't kosher enough. And anybody that thinks differently is a tzedakah va'apikoyos. Ve'eina kodesh baruch hu soivel tzadikim ka'ela. I'm quoting the Lashon of the Nitziv. Nobody doubted their tzidkis. Tzadikim, chasidim, va'amelei Torah. So the Nitziv says, some tzadikim HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves more, and some he loves less. They're all tzadikim. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu soivel tzadikim ka'ela. And 300 years before the Nitziv, one of the greatest Mekabonim was Rabbeinu Avrom Azulai, Sefer Chesed LaAvrom. And he uses far harsher language than the Nitziv. And he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu soneh et ha'mekatregim al bonav, gam im tzadikim gedolim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu soneh et ha'mekatregim al bonav. So obviously, as you look at me, I'm a chassid. Should be obvious. We'll leave for another day to discuss what a chassid is. But everybody knows about the Baal Shem Tov. Number 2, as a teacher of all chassidim, regardless of shape, color, and form, is the Noam Elimelech. The Elimelech Milazhens, and in his famous tefillah, that Chassidim v'Yan Shemasa say before davening every morning, there's this famous line, Tein v'libeinu shenira kol echad malo es chavereinu v'lo chesronam. Why is it that we always focus on our midas and on the shortcomings of others? We have it the opposite, the wrong way. Shenira kol echad malo es chavereinu. We should have far more tolerance and far more ahavas Yisrael. I think we are extremely lacking in this area. Kodesh Baruch Hu is a father. That is how we refer to Kodesh Baruch Hu in our tefillos. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Avorachama. And if we call a Kodesh Baruch Hu a father, it is because we should relate to him as a father. Just a few moments ago, we discussed the Ramban, Bonim Atam Nashem Elokech. You cannot love the father and hate his children. I don't think anybody would tolerate that. You can't be my friend and fight my children. Ze lo holech. This is something which is totally unacceptable. So you can't love a Kodesh Baruch Hu and hate his children. That is impossible. If you love a Kodesh Baruch Hu, you need to love his children. And we are all a Kodesh Baruch Hu's children. We are all bonov shel Elokei. So I had the schus of being Mishamish, the great Kloisenberger Rebbe. Many years I was his Talmud. And I see him as my Rebbe Muvak. And as you all probably know, he lost a wife and 11 children in the Holocaust. I myself, I'm a son of survivors, my father and mother, Baruch Hashem, sheyichu adbi, as girl said, and I once heard from my Rebbe, the Kloisenberger says, when we came out of those camps, we would never believe that Jews would ever fight each other or hate each other. There is so much hatred out there. Look at this unbelievable hatred of these murderers in Harnaf. There are too many people that hate us in the first place. Do we need to add on amongst our brothers? We are a small people, hated in the entire world. How could one Jew hate another? This is something which I cannot grasp. This is something which is unbelievable. And this is an area in which we need a lot of chizuk to bring shalom. Talmid HaChacham Amar Mishalom B'Yolim. Lo nitnu Torah L'Ahav Shalom B'Yolim. The Rambam writes at the end of Hilchos Chanukah. So we all need a lot of chizuk in Torah, in Tefillah, in Amunah, and in Midas Toivus, and in Ahava Sarei. Ishes Re'eu Yazayru, U'La'ochav Yomer Chazal. Feeling the pain of other Jews, feeling their desperation, and trying to be helpful. Dedicating time and effort gemilas chasadim, to care about other people, and to try to ease their pain. So there's a very famous story of Rabbi Moshe Leib Misasa, who was a disciple of Rabbi Melech Milizhensk. And Rabbi Moshe Leib Misasa once said that the profound meaning of Yahavta Re'echa Kamocho I learned from a Gentile. So I don't want you to be surprised. That is in accordance with the Baal Shem Tov principles. The Baal Shem Tov said whatever a person sees, whatever he hears, whatever experiences, comes to teach you. Whatever we see or experience comes to teach us something. So Rav Moshe Leib Sasavas said, I was once walking on the street and I hear two goyim conversing. Mr. A asks Mr. B, do you love me? And Mr. B says, aren't you ashamed to ask? I mean, we've been the best of friends for 20 years, of course. So Mr. A asks, so what hurts me? Mr. B says, how would I know? You didn't tell me. Mr. A asks, how would you say you love me if you don't even know what hurts me? But you didn't tell me. Did you inquire? Do you care? Did you ask? How could you say you love me if you don't even know what hurts me? Said Rav Moshe Leib Sasava. That is the Evan HaBoichen. That is the test of Ahava Saleim. You don't even know what hurts me. So how could you say you love me? But you didn't tell me. Do I have to tell you? Do you care? Did you inquire? Did you ask? So ultimately, this is the test. When tragedy strikes, I think we have to stick together and invest far more in Midas Davis and Ahavas Reim, in Gemilas Chasadim, and stay away from Machlaikas. Reject Machlaikas with total rejection. There are enough Jew haters out there. We don't need to add to them. Let us all hope that we will see Rachamei Shamayim Be'id Galia Velo Be'id Kasya. So Zmiras L'Shabbos Mincha Sosha that came out a few months ago is a nice word. Leil Shabbos Kodesh, Friday night before sitting down to Suda Shabbos, there's a tefillah which Hasidim say, probably many others. We say HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moed Ani Lefonecha Al Kol HaChesed Asher Osisu Imadi V'She'ata Osed La'aseh Simi V'Yem Kol B'nei Beisi. So when you thank on the Chesadim of the past, you say Asher Osisu Imadi. But then we go on to ask for Chesadim in the future, and we say Asher Ata Osed La'aseh Simi V'Yem Kol B'nei Beisi. So my idea is, regarding the past, we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all his chasadim. We believe that everything ultimately is chesed. But please, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for the future, give us chasadim that even our kids should be able to thank you. Kol b'nei beisi, the ingalach, the meidalach, the little children. It should be chasadim that would be obvious to everyone. And the entire family should be able to be united in giving thanks and gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Chasodo HaMerubim. We should all know better days of Rachamim and Chesed. We should all make our own Cheshbon and Nefesh and let this tragedy bring about that we should all be better people and better Jews and more loving Jews. And we should be Zoichet Chazdei Shemayim. Ki dam avodav yikoim, v'nokem yoshev letzorov, v'chiper ad mosoi amoi, and we should be zoichet to be as Mashiach tzedkeinu, v'simchas oilam al roisham b'meiru v'yomeinu. Amen.